I'm Assemblywoman Kimberly Jean-Pierre, and I represent the Great District, the 11th Assembly District in the state of New York. I'm so honored and proud to partner with Community Watch with our great host, Bishop Andy Lewter, who would bring you various elected officials to discuss their platform, who they are, so you could be able to know who are the great people that represent you in the different levels of government. It's an honor for me to partner with Community Watch to help you understand what's happening right here on Long Island, right here where you live in your community.
Thank you so very much, State Assemblywoman Kimberly Jean-Pierre. And we thank you again for making this particular platform available. Friends, I am Andy C. Lewter, and I'm your host for Community Watch. And we take time each and every week to have a conversation with particular individuals in our community who's making a difference. Today is no different than that, because today we have a local educator by the name of Naima Robinson who is sharing with us. Thank you, Sister Robinson, for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So there are a number of things that we want to talk about, but before we do, I don't want to assume that our audience is already familiar with who Naima Robinson is. So let's talk a few minutes about who you are in terms of your background, your biography. We know that you are a Long Island product. Every mother likes to talk about her children, and then you have some very well-known parents that we want to talk about as well.
Well, my mother is Dr. Pamela Robinson Allen, and she runs a community program here in Suffolk County, and it services young people. It's called KYC for Keep Your Change, and they do academic support at the Quintine Center in North Amityville. She was an educator for 35 years and a professor at Long Island University. And my father is a judge in Suffolk County, and he is presiding over drug court and mental health court.
Yeah.
And I am an educator and a historian and a researcher. I wear many hats. I do African dance and perform, and I also teach our young students about African history, Black American history, and am encouraging all cultural arts.
Yeah. And then you have a daughter I know that you're very proud of as well, and I'm sure you want to talk a bit about her as well.
I have a magnificent daughter. Her name is Samaya. She's 16, and she's a student at Sacred Heart Academy.
Ah, great. Let's talk about you in a little more in depth. You're a product of which high school, which college, and I do know that you are a PhD candidate. And so talk a bit even about your graduate work.
Okay, so I am pursuing a doctorate. I am in the final stages of my dissertation defense at Long Island University. And my dissertation topic is teachers' comfortability discussing racism in the classroom with their students. And I have been interviewing students from all over New York City to gauge their level of willingness and comfort with discussing racism in the classroom with their students when they bring it up, and when it's in the news, and when it is something that they're thinking about. Yeah, and it's been very enlightening. I am a graduate of Amityville High School, and I'm a graduate of University of Buffalo with a degree in history, and Long Island University with 2 master's degrees. Yes.
Now, not too terribly long ago, you blessed our class. We convened a class, and you talked extensively about certain figurines that are of note. You've done that on 2 occasions. I want to talk a bit about those individuals that you have talked about in the past and why they are important.
Okay.
So let's begin with in the most recent presentation you did, you talked about these cells that continue to grow and have outlived the physical life of their hosts. Let's talk about her.
Yeah, so we talked about Henrietta Lacks. And Henrietta Lacks is an ordinary Black woman from Baltimore, Maryland area. And in 1951, she went to Johns Hopkins University to receive treatment for cervical cancer. She had terminal cervical cancer. And her cells were clipped from her cervix and were put into a petri dish, and they continued to reproduce. And so her cells, she was unaware that her cells were taken, but after her death, her cells continued to reproduce and were used for research all over the world. Her cells were used for almost 60 years. They're still being used today. Mm-hmm. And vaccines have been tested using her cells. Radiation has been tested using her cells. They're called the HeLa cells. Mm-hmm. They have produced millions of dollars for medical research, and her family was unaware that her cells were being used in that way. So it's a remarkable story, and it's an ordinary story, because black bodies in America have been used and monetized and the source of wealth in many industries. The medical industry is just one. But her story is unique because it's not just her labor, her mm-hmm. body being worked, her sweat, her tears, her blood, but it's actually her cells, and the fact that they are considered immortal cells because her cells continue to reproduce, which points to a sort of unexplainable power sure. that black bodies have, and that's exploited for many commercial uses in the capitalist system or in the Western world, and also to the way that her family and her own person were excluded from any of the benefit of that they were taken advantage of and exploited the way so many of us have been, the way so much of our labor and our bodies are used in that way. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also remarkable because there is this mystery to how it is that her cells are able to reproduce in that way. And that's something that no one can really answer. And it also continues, it makes her life continue, that her story continues to be told. In some way, her work continues, and the use of her cells continues to help others. In the way that even through what we've suffered in this country, much of what we've suffered and much of the pain that we've gone through has actually turned out to be used for good, and has actually been a force for so much good.
Yeah. And one of the other individuals that you talked extensively about was Harriet Tubman. Now, she has been featured in local cinematography here of late, yes. And so we are perhaps a little more familiar with her than we would have been yes. in the absence of this movie. But tell us a little bit about Harriet that we perhaps didn't know before.
Well, I think we are familiar with Harriet Tubman, where it's almost cliche to mention, our great African-American heroes and mention Harriet Tubman. Because what we know that she did is that she escaped from slavery, and that she took the brave job of going back and taking other people and helping other people escape. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And that just shows her bravery as a woman, that she did something that even the strongest and most courageous men wouldn't do. Mm-hmm. That she did that even when she was unable to read and write. But what's remarkable to me about Harriet Tubman is that she did that in spite of the fact that she was physically ill and suffered great pain her entire life. Mm-hmm. That she had an injury where she was struck on the head at the age of 13, that because of that she had seizures, she had narcolepsy, she had severe migraines, she had a whole host of medical conditions that were never treated. And that she pushed through that pain. And nothing, I think, speaks more to the power of black women than that. She pushed right through that pain and still continued to do what she felt was God's work and what she felt God really was calling her to do beyond her own safety and her own self-interest, but she did it for others. And she continued to fight for freedom for all of the enslaved people in the United States, and then she became the first soldier in the United States history. Working in the Union Army as a spy and a commander of soldiers. So it is just remarkable and inspiring, because as a black woman, what she represents is just the unlimited power and courage that we have.
Sister Robinson, one of the items that arrested my attention in your presentation, this most recent presentation that you shared, was your usage and reference to Native black Americans. And you've kind of particularized that term. Now, here of late, African American, Afro American, we've used a host of names to describe ourselves. Colored Negro, Harlem Renaissance. There have been a host of names. But you have kind of, perhaps not coined, but you certainly have affirmed this term, Native Black American. And you had an explanation for that. And I want you to share that with our audience as well.
Yeah, so I must say that I borrowed the term from Dr. Claude Anderson, the economist. And I find that his use of the term really spoke to me because a native black being the what we consider Black Americans, because we do not really have a direct contact with any other nation. The continent of Africa is our home, but all human beings can claim the continent of Africa as their home because we know that all human beings can trace our origin to Africa. But that because we didn't lose, but our land was taken, our story of where we come from in Africa is taken from us. Our names and our culture were taken from us. We become children of America. We become native blacks. And the term native black also refers to our connection with black people that were here before the beginning of this country. And also the fact that the establishment and the growth of the United States really owes a great debt to its black inhabitants, and we are native blacks, meaning that they owe us a tremendous debt for building this country and for all of the work and intellectual and physical labor that we put into building this country, that we are in fact the children of this country, and for many of us know no other country, and have been here for generations before, and many other immigrants can claim. We've been here, some of us for 14, 15 generations have been here.
One of the other terms that you introduced to our students here of late was this term, mitochondria Eve.
Yeah.
And I found that equally fascinating. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit and acquaint our audience with what you mean by that particular term?
So the idea of mitochondrial Eve is we have RNA and mitochondrial DNA, right? And our mitochondrial DNA, or our mDNA, is traced through the maternal line. So it can be traced from a mother and then passed on to her daughter, and then if her daughter has children, it's passed on to the next generation, and so on. And through that, we can trace our DNA back to an original mitochondrial DNA, which comes from Ethiopia, in Africa, in the Great Lakes region of Africa, or the Ethiopian highlands, where civilization was birthed. And it is this place where the original human beings, or Homo sapiens, come from an African woman. And I think that most of us are aware that, Mary Leakey, and they discovered the first ancestral human remains in Ethiopia. I think they called her Lucy. But that this is actually a scientific testing that takes not just the human remains, but our DNA back to Africa, to an African woman, a black woman. And she's usually given the scientific name mitochondrial Eve, Eve being like an original woman. So... and that dates back about 150,000 years. So I think that was where we had some of our discussion around that date. But that's approximately how far back her remains can go. They're dated back about 150,000 years.
Okay. Listen, and I'm getting ready to switch gears. But before I do, there was a segment of your presentation that you talked about the difficulty and the challenge of male-female relationships in the African American, in the native black community, the native black community, because of certain traumas. One being post-slavery trauma. And so I want you to spend just a minute talking about that before we shift gears.
Okay, so I think that it's a large topic to talk about any kind of social relations and issues, but we can trace some of the problems back to the 5 points of trauma that Dr. Joy DeGruy discusses in her post-traumatic slave syndrome. And those 5 points of trauma are chattel slavery, which starts in 1619 and goes to the end of slavery in 1865. And then the post-slavery, the trauma of what was Reconstruction and then becomes like 100 years of lynching and Jim Crow in the South, which goes into about 1965. And then, so those two, we can just stop right there, those 2 points of trauma really destroyed black female-male relationships, black families. Ta-Nehisi Coates calls slavery the commodification of the destruction of black families. So black families are destroyed in a very methodical way, and one of the ways that they're destroyed is through beatings and sexual violence, rape. So we actually, in my previous presentation, we talked about the scene in the movie Sankofa. And even we talked about Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'll use that as an example. If you guys remember the story of Fannie Lou Hamer being beaten in prison, the police didn't beat her. They called black prisoners, 2 men, to come and beat her with a blackjack. And that is the psychology of destroying black male and female relationships. They use black men to do their work, to beat her. And those men didn't want to beat her, but, excuse me, but they can't refuse. They have no choice. And so now they are ostracized in a way from the community. And that destroys, it destroys them because they have to do that. And it destroys the woman's ability to now try to repair herself and repair him from his abuse, from his trauma also. And so the beatings, and also we talked about the sexual violence and how the black men are unable to protect women from that, and how black women are unable to refuse, and how that makes it very hard to look at each other, because looking at each other, they are reminders of that failure. So that being a reminder of that failure continues with us to this day, where it just becomes hard to look at each other. And so we find ourselves wanting to flee, wanting to get out of the race, wanting to look at something different, just not wanting to look at anyone that's going to remind you of that weakness or inability to protect each other from the system that's oppressive.
And we've been talking a great deal about the content of this conversation presentation that you did with us recently. I want to take a quick minute and share with you our guest, Naima Robinson, at work, more particularly as she presented some of the things that she's been talking about for these last several minutes. And then we'll be right back to continue this conversation.
Okay, so you have the emasculation of the black man, you have the soiling of the black woman, you have the pathology that comes through that, the reminding of the weakness, and then you have that need to want to see something else because you don't want to be reminded of that weakness. So now we're in 2020 now, and we're integrated, and we have men and women trying to have healthy relationships, and you're still dealing with this intergenerational trauma that has never been resolved. And then the same thing keeps coming up today, because today we are dealing with discrimination in the workplace, or maybe the paycheck is not enough and you're trying to keep the American dream happening in the car and the house and all of that. And when it doesn't work, when it's not happening, when you're still struggling living paycheck to paycheck, there is the temptation to look and blame each other for that. Why could the woman can look at the man and say, why couldn't you protect me? Why couldn't you protect me from this discrimination? Make sure that I have this thing. And the man could say, well, I want someone that doesn't look at me, that doesn't remind me of that. So the woman wants to feel safe, like she didn't feel safe in slavery. Now she wants to feel safe in a racist society. And the man wants someone that's not going to question that, or his ability to provide that safety, or his inability to provide that safety. So that pathology keeps going, and we see symptoms of that in our relationships. And I bring it up to mention how, so that we can remember that we are extremely fragile in the system of racism and white supremacy, how fragile we are, where that fragility, that vulnerability comes from. It comes from the exposure. It comes from the 5 points of trauma, that it goes back to the origin of our bodies being used and monetized for the system, and that it was methodically designed to create an imbalance and a challenge in our relationships with one another, especially as men and women. And when we understand how fragile we are, how vulnerable we are, then, and we can understand why we come to a place where we are today, where we actually are fleeing from each other. We do not want to be together because we remind each other of all the trauma that we've had for all the generations, right? So we're looking outside of our race.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that content and that material as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Again, this is Community Watch. I'm your host, Andy C. Lewter, and our guest today is a doctoral candidate by the name of Naima Robinson. She's a local educator here in the New York City area, a resident of Long Island, and certainly an asset to us here in North Amityville. Sister Robinson, I want to shift gears a little bit because in 1973, I was a sophomore at Oberlin College. I was a Black History major and was in hot pursuit of a degree in that particular field. And I also was wrestling with my own calls to ministry, and I also thought I was going to be an attorney as well. And so, and then what you're seeing here, I was additionally a communication major. In 1973, Oberlin College did not have distribution requirements, so you could declare a major early on. And so I ended up with a triple major. But one of those majors was in Black Studies, and in that year we had a guest lecturer by the name of Dr. Ben Yosef Chikanen. Mm-hmm. And I became a student of his and an admirer of his. And I spent a great deal of time studying his work. He had a book, self-published at the time, entitled The African Origins of the Three Major Religions, right. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. It was an eye-opening experience, and it gave me a wider view of spirituality and religious institutions, and I found myself no longer confined to the narrow parochial lane of Christianity, and he helped to broaden my worldview. And so I consider myself a protege of him to some degree. I have been fascinated that you have been described as a daughter of Dr. Ben. So I always kind of felt that what we had in common was this affinity and affection for Dr. Ben Yosef Chikanen. Tell me when you first met him and what your experiences have been with his work and research.
So my parents were very vigilant about taking me to places to learn about Black history. And specifically in the 80s, Dr. Ben took a tour. Every year he took people to Egypt. And that was the thing to do if you could go on one of these tours to Egypt, to Kemet. And so I remember going, studying, learning, listening to lectures with Dr. Ben and John Henrik Clark and others who really studied Egyptology, Muata Ashby. And I've had that education. I got a deeper education in the history of ancient Egypt, or Kemet, later on through a teacher. And it's African tradition is we honor our teachers and we name our teachers, so that we know where does our history come from. Yeah. And because our history is not easily accessible even in libraries or on the internet, we usually receive our history from a teacher. Sure. You learn at the foot of a teacher. And so we've those of us who continue to teach Black history can trace back, well, whose feet did we sit at and who did we learn from? So Dr. Ben was one of the first ones, and I think he really initiated the idea that we need to reclaim ancient Egypt and Kemet, that's our history. he had to first establish that these people are black people, which in itself comes from the fact that we're in a racist context where it would not have mattered otherwise, except that they had been depicted as white for so long, and Egypt had been kind of removed out of Africa, and we were miseducated that this
Middle
was
East as opposed
right,
to Africa,
that we weren't responsible for this. So he reintroduced that we are responsible for this tremendous history, but also that it's the origin of these great religions, and that all of the religions of the world can trace their origin to Africa, that these are our places. Now, we have been put outside of what originally is ours, and that we've been made to feel like outsiders in a religious context that we created, and so that in itself, I think, is empowering. It leads to a tremendous amount of controversy, but it's fact, and it has to be acknowledged that we are the origins, that we are that we created, religious idea and spiritual thought and civilization and mathematics and science and art and literature and all. So when we teach children, we need to let them know that all of it, Hippocrates learned in Egypt, in Kemet, that Pythagoras, learned in Egypt, in Kemet. They learned from Imhotep. Architecture comes from Egypt. But also that this idea of Egypt is not the geographical boundaries that are on the map today, but that the idea of Kemet is actually all of the Nile Valley, which goes all the way deep down into the Sudan. And so you have Nubia and Kush, and all of these southern, what we think of as southern, is actually northern, because that's the source of the Nile, which flows what we look at as north, but it's up north, right, into the delta. So all of eastern northern Africa is considered Kemet. And these are, of course, black people and brown people and all different shades of people. Their complexion was fairly irrelevant, except in today's context where we have to force that they are shown to be people of color or melanin-dominant people. But I think that I give so much love and credit to Dr. Ben for making us proud of that origin and understand that classical history that we were taught was the property of Greeks and Romans, that's rightly our intellectual property, and that we would have none of this. We would have none of Socrates or Plato without the schools at Luxor and the teachings in Egypt and in the temples. We would have none of that. And Timbuktu. And so I was just going to mention, as is our tradition, the teacher that taught me was Master Naba Lamusa Mordedenibek, who is from West Africa. And what I learned is that even after the destruction of Kemet, and even after the Roman Empire reaches its height, our knowledge was taken into West Africa and was kept secret and was kept protected in West Africa. So you can go into places in West Africa, the Dogon people in the areas of Mali and in Timbuktu, they kept our knowledge. And so our knowledge is not lost, it's just difficult to find.
All right. Well, listen, friends, for the last several minutes, you have been watching and listening to Naima Robinson. I am your host, Andy C. Lewter. This is Community Watch. It's an opportunity for us to share with you individuals that we think that you need to know. Now, actually, we could go on for several more minutes, and I'm going to take this opportunity to invite Sister Robinson to come back. We could spend another whole half hour just talking about Dr. Ben, his impact. I have some anecdotes from Harvard University, some position papers that I took that were refuted because Dr. Ben was my source material. But we can talk about that at another time. And I want to take you back to Kimberly Jean-Pierre and thank her for making this platform possible. Thank again Naima Robinson for sharing so much knowledge and dropping so much science on us today.
Hi, I'm Assemblywoman Kimberly Jean-Pierre, and I represent the 11th Assembly District. I hope you had a great time watching Community Watch, and I hope you were able to have a deeper understanding of the various elected officials and know who they are and got a chance to meet them throughout the different segments of shows with our great host, Bishop Andy Lewter. Keep looking out for your local elected officials and stay informed.